The barn was alive that night. Light bulbs strung across the rafters flickered like stars caught in a net, and the wooden beams above us groaned with every bass note that rattled the speakers. It smelled like summer, warm hay, spilled beer, and the faint sweetness of cut grass drifting through the open doors. Evan had been throwing these barn parties every year since high school. Back then they were wild, chaotic, half the county showing up just for an excuse to dance barefoot in the dirt. Now, a few years later they still carried that same charm, but something had changed. Maybe we'd all gotten older. Maybe it was me. I leaned against one of the hay bales, plastic cup in hand, pretending to care about the cheap beer sloshing inside it. People were laughing, shouting, singing along to songs we all knew by heart, but I felt like a ghost in the middle of it all. That was when I saw him. Mr. Carter. Evan's dad. He wasn't in the thick of it. He never was. He stood near the wide barn doors, half in shadow, half in the golden glow of the lights. He didn't look uncomfortable exactly, just separate. Watching. Like the whole scene was a movie he'd seen before. He looked good. Better than I wanted to admit. Broad shoulders beneath a plain flannel shirt, sleeves rolled halfway up his forearms. His hair was darker than Evan's, streaked at the edges with silver that caught the light. There was a steadiness about him, something that didn't fit the noise and chaos around us. I told myself that's why I noticed him. Because he stood out. Because he looked like a misplaced character on the wrong stage. But then, when my eyes found his again, something tightened in my chest. Because he was already looking at me. It wasn't a passing glance. Not the casual acknowledgement you give someone across a room. It was longer than that. Heavy. Searching. My throat went dry. I looked down at my cup, pretending it was the most fascinating thing in the world. But the damage was done. I could still feel it. The weight of his gaze. Like he'd seen something in me I hadn't meant to show. I tried to laugh it off, to shake it off. I let Evan drag me onto the makeshift dance floor when some throwback songs started blaring, but even as I stumbled through the motions, my mind wasn't on the music. It kept circling back to that glance. Every time I looked over, he was still there. Quiet. Watching. Not staring, but not looking away either. By 11, the barn was sweltering. People had peeled off their jackets, their laughter echoing louder than the songs. I stepped outside for air, leaning against the fence post, letting the night wrap around me. And just like that, there he was again. A few feet away, leaning against the side of the barn, hands tucked into his pockets. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The music muffled through the wooden walls, crickets humming in the tall grass beyond the field. I thought about leaving. About heading back inside before it got awkward. But I didn't. Because something about the way he looked at me held me in place. It wasn't obvious. He wasn't smiling, wasn't smirking, wasn't doing anything that should have made me nervous. But there was something in his eyes. Something unspoken. Like he was asking a question I didn't know how to answer. The sound of voices spilled out as the barn door creaked open behind us, breaking whatever moment had been forming. I turned my head quickly, trying to act normal, like I hadn't been standing there frozen in place. But even as I walked back inside, even as I forced myself to laugh at some joke I didn't really hear, I couldn't shake it. The way he looked at me. It wasn't the look of a friend's dad keeping an eye on things. It wasn't the polite acknowledgement of someone older making sure the kids didn't get too rowdy. It was something else. Something that pressed against the edges of my thoughts, something that made my chest ache with a question I didn't dare put into words. And I knew, even then, even before anything had happened, that tonight wasn't going to be just another barn party. Something was already changing. By the time the night had settled into its slower rhythm, the barn felt different. The crowd had thinned, half the guests spilling out into the fields, chasing the stars with cigarettes and whispered conversations. Inside, the music was softer now, more background than center stage. It was the hour of the night when people either paired off or drifted into corners to breathe. I was one of the drifters. I slipped toward the far side of the barn where the hay was stacked in neat, golden walls. It was quieter there, the laughter from the center muffled by the space. I let my back rest against a bale, lifting my cup and taking a sip of beer that had gone warm hours ago. For the first time that night, I thought maybe I could disappear into the shadows. But then I heard him. "Not really your scene anymore, is it?" His voice cut through the quiet, low and steady, like it belonged more to the night than the noise behind us. I turned, startled, and there he was, Mr. Carter, leaning against a post not 10 feet away. His arms were crossed, his posture relaxed in that deliberate way men carry themselves when they're both guarded and comfortable. I shrugged, trying to play it off. "Guess not. Maybe I'm getting too old for this." He laughed, not mockingly, just soft and genuine. You've got a long way to go before old. Something about the way he said it, calm, almost certain, made me look down, heat prickling at my neck. I forced out a small laugh, though my chest was tight. When I looked back up, he'd moved. Not much. Just a couple of steps closer. But enough that I could see him clearly now, the creases at the corners of his eyes, the way the light caught on the stubble of his jaw. The space between us felt charged in a way I didn't know how to name. "So what about you?" I asked, trying to steady myself with conversation. "Why hang out here instead of letting Evan run wild like always?" He smirked faintly. "Call it habit. Somebody's gotta make sure the place doesn't burn down." I smiled, but it faded as quickly as it came. Because his eyes didn't move on. They stayed on me. And suddenly I realized he wasn't talking about the barn. The air thickened. The noise of the party blurred into nothing. It was just him and me in the fragile space between us. He shifted slightly, leaning back against the post, his arm brushing against the edge of the hay where my hand rested. It wasn't deliberate, or maybe it was. Either way, the back of his hand grazed mine. The touch was feather light. Barely there. But it felt like electricity shooting up my arm. We both froze. I should have pulled away. That would have been the normal thing to do. To laugh it off, make some excuse, walk back to the music and noise and pretend nothing happened. But I didn't. I stayed still, holding my breath, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure he could hear it. He didn't move either. The seconds stretched, bending, pulling tighter until they felt like they might snap. I told myself maybe it was an accident. That he hadn't meant anything by it. But the longer he let it linger, the less I believed that. And the less I wanted to. Finally, he shifted just enough to pull his hand back, clearing his throat softly, like he'd just remembered where we were. His eyes flicked toward the floor, then back to me as if checking whether I'd noticed. Of course I had. I wanted to say something. To break the silence, to ease the weight of whatever had just passed between us. But the words stuck in my throat. So instead, I just stood there, staring at the place where our hands had almost been together, my skin still buzzing with the memory of it. Because whatever that moment was, whatever it wasn't, it was too close to be nothing. Silence has a way of saying things words can't. After that brush of his hand, the noise of the party seemed far away, like it belonged to some other world I wasn't part of anymore. Inside that barn, the music thumped, people laughed, bottles clinked. But around us, around me and him, was still. He didn't speak at first. Neither did I. We just stood there, two people tethered by something fragile and unspoken. Finally, he exhaled, a low, tired sigh, and leaned against the same stack of hay I was using for support. The small shift made my chest tighten. He was close now. Not touching, but close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating off him. "You ever feel like you're surrounded by people," he said softly, eyes fixed on some point in the distance, "and still feel completely invisible?" The question startled me. I wasn't sure what I'd expected. Maybe small talk, maybe nothing at all, but not that. Not something that cut straight through me like a blade. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Yeah. All the time." His jaw flexed, the muscles working like he was holding something back. "Me too." The words came out rough, raw in a way I wasn't used to hearing from him. Evan's dad was the kind of man who usually seemed steady, anchored, the kind of man who always knew what to do. But right then his voice held something different. Something cracked. I wanted to say more. I wanted to tell him I understood. That sometimes I felt like I was just going through the motions, a face in a crowd no one really saw. But the weight of the moment pinned the words to my chest. So instead I just sat there, letting the silence fill the space. And in that silence I felt something shift. His arm brushed mine again, this time not by mistake. Just a quiet movement, deliberate, like he was testing the ground we were standing on. I didn't move. For a long moment, neither of us breathed. There was no music in that silence, no laughter, no barn. Just the heat of his arm against mine, the sound of his breath, the thundering of my own heartbeat in my ears. And then, as if realizing how far we'd let the silence stretch, he pulled back slightly, clearing his throat. He stared at the barn floor, then at the door, anywhere but me. But it didn't matter. The moment had already spoken. Because silence doesn't lie. Silence doesn't pretend. Silence says the things you can't let yourself say out loud. And in that silence, I knew something had changed. We hadn't confessed. We hadn't touched in a way anyone could call more than chance. But still, I felt it. You felt it. The silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It was full. Full of questions we were too afraid to ask. Full of answers we weren't ready to admit. I didn't know what would come next. I didn't know if this was the start of something or the end of everything. But as I sat there, with the night humming around us and his presence heavy beside me, one truth pressed down on me with a weight I couldn't ignore. Something had shifted. And we both knew it. The barn had grown quieter by then. The kind of quiet that settles after midnight, when the crowd thins and the laughter softens into murmurs. The music still played, but low, a background hum instead of the heartbeat of the night. I hadn't moved from my spot on the hay. I wasn't sure I could. Not with the way the air around us had changed, not with the way he sat so close that I could still feel where his arm had brushed mine. He hadn't left either. He stayed, elbows resting loosely on his knees, head tilted down as if studying the floorboards. It should have felt awkward. It should have been uncomfortable, two people sitting in silence with too much between them. But it wasn't. It was heavy, yes, but also steady. I don't know how long we stayed like that. 5 minutes. 10. Maybe more. Time had slowed into something different, bending around the edges of that silence until it felt like only he and I existed. And then, without warning, it happened. His hand moved, just slightly, just enough, and rested on top of mine. Not a graze. Not an accident. A choice. It wasn't forceful, wasn't claiming. It was quiet. Careful. But it was there. And it stayed. The weight of his hand pressed into me, warm and steady, and my chest tightened in a way that was both terrifying and electric. My pulse raced, pounding in my ears so loudly I thought the whole barn could hear it. I didn't move. I couldn't. I just let it be. I let myself feel the way his palm fit against the back of my hand, the way his thumb shifted ever so slightly as though he was fighting the urge to hold tighter. It was the smallest gesture in the world, but it felt monumental. Like a door opening where there hadn't been one before. When I finally found the courage to look up, his eyes were already on mine. The look he gave me, I'll never forget it. It wasn't playful. It wasn't careless. It was careful, searching, almost afraid. Like he was asking me a question without a single word. Do you feel this too? Do you want this too? I held his gaze, my breath catching in my throat. My body gave the answer my voice couldn't. I didn't pull away. For a heartbeat, it felt like we were suspended in some fragile, perfect balance. His hand on mine. My silence answering his. Two people admitting something wordless in the dim glow of a barn after midnight. And then he pulled back. Quickly. Too quickly. His hand left mine like the moment had burned him, and he straightened up, running a hand through his hair, shaking his head as if trying to erase what had just happened. Sorry, he muttered, his voice rough, uneven. The word cut through me. I hated it. I wanted to tell him he didn't have to be sorry. That I hadn't wanted him to move. That it hadn't felt wrong at all. But my throat closed around the words, and all I managed was a shallow breath. He pushed himself up, pacing a few steps away, his hands still dragging through his hair. His shoulders looked tense, drawn tight. And me, I just sat there, my hands still tingling where his had been, my chest aching with the ghost of that touch. Because even though it had lasted only a few seconds, it was enough. Enough to prove something was there. Enough to prove that I hadn't imagined it. Enough to make me know with absolute certainty that he had felt it too. I stared down at my own hand, still open on my knee, like maybe it could still hold the warmth he'd left behind. My fingers twitched, wanting to reach for him again, but I didn't. Instead, I just sat there, swallowing hard, my breath unsteady. He stayed a few feet away, silent, his back turned toward me. The distance between us was small, but it felt enormous after what we'd just shared. Finally, he spoke again, his voice low, almost to himself. That shouldn't have happened. The words were heavy, but I didn't believe them. Not really. Because the way his voice cracked, the way his shoulders tensed, I knew he didn't believe them either. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. All I knew was that his touch, brief as it had been, wasn't going anywhere. It had carved itself into me. It had stayed. And no matter what came next, nothing would change that. The night had tipped past its loudest point. The barn was quieter now, pockets of people scattered across the field, the music muffled, the laughter softer. The air was cooler and the smell of dew was beginning to rise off the grass. I found him outside. He stood near the edge of the field, his silhouette outlined against the faint orange glow of the barn lights. His hands were in his pockets, his shoulders set like he was holding something heavier than the night itself. I almost turned around. I almost let the distance between us stay what it was. But my feet betrayed me, carrying me closer until I was just a few steps away. He didn't look at me. Not at first. His eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, on the dark line where the field met the sky. You don't have to apologize, I said softly, breaking the silence before I could lose the nerve. He shifted, glancing at me from the corner of his eye. His jaw tightened. I crossed a line. Maybe, I admitted, my heart pounding. I took a shaky breath. But it didn't feel like nothing. The words came out before I could stop them. Too honest. Too bare. For a moment he didn't move. Didn't even breathe. And then his head turned fully, his eyes meeting mine under the pale wash of moonlight. There was something in his gaze I hadn't seen before. Fear, yes, but also longing. A question he couldn't quite ask. I swallowed hard. My throat felt raw. Did it feel like nothing to you? The silence that followed was unbearable. I thought he might deny it, dismiss it, laugh it off the way people do when they're scared. But he didn't. Instead, his voice dropped low, almost breaking. What if this is real? The words hung between us, trembling in the night air. Real. Not an accident. Not a mistake. Not something to ignore. I stared at him, my chest aching, my mind spinning. Real meant complicated. Real meant dangerous. Real meant crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed. But it also meant honest. And maybe it meant worth it. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know if I had the courage to say anything at all. So I stepped closer, just enough that the distance between us felt thin. I don't know what it is, I whispered. But I don't think I want to pretend it isn't there. His breath caught. I could hear it in the quiet. His shoulders softened, just slightly, like the weight he carried had shifted, even if it hadn't lifted. We stood there like that, too close, too still, until finally, almost tentatively, he lifted a hand. It hovered for a second, as though he was giving me the chance to pull away, to say no. When I didn't, he let it rest gently against the side of my face. The touch was soft, hesitant, but it made my eyes close without meaning to. My breath stuttered, caught between fear and relief. He didn't lean in. Neither did I. There was no kiss, no rushing past the moment. Just the warmth of his palm on my skin, the quiet press of his forehead against mine a moment later, our breaths mingling in the still night air. I'd never known silence could feel so full. I opened my eyes to find his closed, his brow drawn, like even this small, fragile closeness, was something he'd been starving for without realizing it. When he finally pulled back, it was only an inch. His voice was raw when he spoke. I don't know if I can want this. The words stung. But then he added, barely audible, and I don't know if I can stop. My chest ached with something I couldn't name. I didn't have answers. I didn't have promises. All I had was the truth that burned inside me, the truth that no amount of silence could erase. It doesn't feel like nothing, I whispered again. And for the first time all night, he didn't look away. We didn't move for a long time. His hand had fallen away, but the ghost of it lingered against my skin, warm and steady, like an echo I didn't want to fade. His words, I don't know if I can want this, and I don't know if I can stop, played over in my head until I didn't know which part made my chest ache more. I thought maybe he'd walk away. That he'd break the moment, draw a line, put distance back where it belonged. But he didn't. He stayed. And so did I. The night pressed around us, quiet and heavy, the barn lights flickering faintly behind us, casting long shadows across the field. The cool air lifted strands of my hair, brushed against my skin, but it wasn't the chill that made me shiver. It was him. His nearness. Finally, I broke the silence, my voice unsteady. You don't have to explain anything to me. His eyes flicked toward mine, something unreadable in them. Maybe I do. I shook my head. No, you don't. Whatever this is, I feel it too. His jaw tightened, but not with denial. More like restraint, like he was holding back words that wanted to spill. We stood there, staring at each other, until the weight of everything pressed us closer without either of us deciding to move. It was small things at first. The way our shoulders brushed when I shifted, the way his hand hovered close to mine as though gravity itself was tugging us together. When our fingers finally touched, it wasn't a dramatic gesture. Just the slow curl of his hand into mine, his callous skin brushing against my palm. The connection was simple. Quiet. But it knocked the air from my lungs. I didn't know I'd been waiting for it until it happened. Waiting for someone to reach across the silence. Waiting for someone to see me, to steady me, to make the night feel less empty. He didn't grip tightly. He just let our hands rest together like something too delicate to hold too hard. And yet, that touch felt more real than anything I'd felt in years. God, he whispered almost to himself. This is crazy. Yeah, I breathed. But it doesn't feel wrong. His thumb moved absently against my knuckle and my chest pulled tight. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, talking in fragments. He asked about my life. Small things, details I didn't expect him to care about. Work, school, where I saw myself going. I told him honestly, maybe more honestly than I'd ever told anyone, about how lost I sometimes felt. How I worried I was just drifting. And he listened. Really listened. Then he told me things too. Little confessions tucked between long pauses. About how he sometimes felt like he'd missed something, like life had rushed past him while he was busy doing what he thought he was supposed to. About how nights like this, watching Evan laugh with his friends, watching all of us grow up, reminded him that time doesn't slow down for anyone. There was a heaviness in his words, but also a strange lightness. Like maybe speaking them out loud gave him permission to breathe again. We laughed a little too. Quiet laughter, the kind that sneaks up in the middle of something serious. At one point I said something dumb about how the barn smelled more like beer than hay, and he smiled, really smiled, and shook his head like I was impossible. The sound of it, the ease of it, felt like something I hadn't realized I was starving for. By the time the night had stretched toward dawn, we were sitting on the back steps of the barn. Our shoulders pressed together, our hands still loosely linked. No one was around us anymore. It felt like the world had folded down to just us. The sky was softening at the edges, pale blue bleeding into the black, and for the first time in a long while, I wasn't thinking about tomorrow. I wasn't thinking about what any of it meant. I was just there. With him. And in that stillness, I realized something I hadn't dared admit before. I hadn't been waiting for some grand moment. Not a kiss, not fireworks, not anything out of a movie. I'd been waiting for this. For someone to sit beside me in the quiet and not need anything more than my presence. For someone to see me and stay. He leaned forward then, just slightly, resting his forehead against mine. It was tentative, gentle, almost reverent. Our breaths mingled in the cool air, and I closed my eyes, letting the closeness settle deep into me. We didn't need words. We didn't need to rush. In that moment, everything was enough. And I thought, I didn't know I was waiting for this. But now that it's here, I don't want to let it go. By the time the last of the guests had drifted away, the night had given up its fight with the morning. The barn stood half asleep behind us, its music long gone, its string lights dimming against the pale rise of dawn. We were still on the back steps. Neither of us had moved much, and yet everything felt different. My shoulder leaned against his. Our hands, still resting together, had grown comfortable, like they'd always belonged that way. I watched the horizon shift from deep blue to a faint blush of pink. The air was cool, damp with dew, the smell of wet grass filling the silence. Birds were beginning to stir in the hedges, their faint chirps stitching the night and morning together. For a long while neither of us spoke. It wasn't the silence of uncertainty anymore. It wasn't the silence that begged to be broken. It was a silence that felt full. A silence I could live in. Finally he shifted, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. You should get some sleep. I let out a soft laugh, my eyes still on the horizon. You too. He hummed in agreement, but neither of us moved. The truth was, I didn't want to. Not yet. I turned to look at him, then really look at him in the new light. The silver in his hair caught the morning glow, the lines at the edges of his eyes deeper now, more visible. But instead of making him look older, it made him look softer. Human. I realized then how rarely I'd seen him like this, unguarded, quiet, vulnerable. Not Evan's dad holding everything together. Just a man sitting on a set of barn steps at dawn, holding on to a moment he didn't know he needed. Do you regret it? I asked suddenly, the question escaping before I could hold it back. His eyes found mine, steady but unreadable. Do you? I shook my head slowly. No. Something in his shoulders eased just slightly. He looked down at our hands, still joined, his thumb brushing absently over my knuckle like he couldn't help it. I don't know what this is, he admitted. I don't know what it means. And I'm scared of it. I am too, I said quietly. The honesty sat between us, raw but steady. He drew in a deep breath, exhaled slowly. But it feels like something I don't want to lose. My chest ached at the words, at the quiet confession I never thought I'd hear. I didn't say anything right away. Instead, I let myself lean into him, my head brushing his shoulder. He didn't pull back. His body stilled, then softened, and he shifted just enough to rest his cheek against the top of my hair. It was such a small thing. But it felt like everything. The sun broke the horizon then, flooding the fields with gold. The world stirred awake, birds louder, the barn creaking, the day arriving whether we wanted it or not. And still we sat there. The weight of reality pressed at the edges of my mind. The questions. The impossibilities. He was my friend's dad. We couldn't explain this to anyone, maybe not even to ourselves. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the urge to run from it. Because it wasn't about what came next. It wasn't about labels or explanations or futures we couldn't predict. It was about this moment. His hand in mine. His shoulder against mine. The quiet morning that held us like a secret. He broke the silence again, his voice rough but gentle. "Whatever this becomes. I'm glad it happened." My throat tightened. I wanted to answer, but words felt too small. So instead, I turned my hand in his, lacing our fingers together, holding on just a little tighter. That was my answer. We stayed until the sun was fully risen, until the world had claimed the night and the barn looked ordinary again. People would wake soon. Life would move forward. Evan would call, ask where I'd gone, laugh about the party, talk about nothing important. And yet, I knew nothing would feel the same. Because something had shifted. Something real had been planted in the quiet of that night, in the soft edges of dawn. I didn't know if it would grow. I didn't know if it would survive. But I knew I wouldn't undo it. Not for anything. When we finally stood, stretching against the stiffness of the steps, he gave me a look I couldn't quite name. A look full of questions, of fears, of hope. And I met it with one of my own. We didn't kiss. We didn't make promises. We didn't need to. As we walked back toward the barn, side by side, the morning sun warming our backs, I realized something that settled deep in my chest. I didn't expect it. I didn't ask for it. But I wouldn't undo it for anything. Because whatever this became, whether it lasted a day, a week, or a lifetime, it was ours. And it was real.